Hey, everybody. My name is Carl James, and welcome back to Can I Have a Word, the podcast that explores language and how it shapes our identity and the people we become. I'm both excited and a little sad to say that this is our last episode of season one. I can't believe it, but here we are. I'm not going to get all weird and sentimental about it, but I just wanted to acknowledge that. So we're just going to jump right into today's episode. So today's word is home. Very appropriate for our last episode. So, quite simply, home can be defined as the place where one lives or resides. Pretty obvious. But in my family, this idea of home actually had an additional connotation for me growing up. As I mentioned before, my family is from Grenada, and as a first generation American, shout out to all the first gen kids out there listening and watching. I'm sure you would agree that it's an understatement to say that we often have a very layered, complicated, interesting relationship to our parents' birthplace. The ancestral home, as we would say, is often the origin of customs and traditions in your house. So the food you eat, the accents and dialects that you hear, the sayings in your house, the holidays you celebrate or acknowledge often stem from these places. When I was growing up, I would hear my parents, grandmother, aunts, uncles, everybody, their friends talk about Grenada, the lifestyle, what it was like back in the day when they were growing up, going to school, the foods they would eat, the mangoes they would get from the tree, the breadfruit, roti, all of these things that sort of defined this place, almost in a romanticized kind of way. And so my association with Grenada was often through these stories and narratives, but it was sort of known as the origins of who we were as a collective unit, as a family. But even with all of those stories that I heard, I never made a lot of visits to Grenada as a kid. I think I'd gone once when I was about 3 or 4, clearly no memory of that. And that was about it. So there was this kind of disconnect for me. On the one hand, Grenada was this almost kind of magical place where, my parents were born and so much of what I knew growing up originated. But I still had this disconnect because it didn't really feel like it was my home. I remember when my grandmother on my mother's side passed away back in the early 90s. I think it was about 1991. I really wanted to go to her funeral because it just seemed like an important moment in our family and something that I really wanted to be there for. I mean, I legit begged to go, begged. And I think it had something to do with wanting to feel more connected to a place that still, as I was just saying before, felt a little bit foreign to me. But I was told that I couldn't go to the funeral, and neither could my brother. We had to stay behind, and my father stayed with us. Now, I know that it was probably financial in terms of the reason why we couldn't go, meaning it would have been a lot more money for a full family of 4 to make the trip as opposed to just my mom. But at the time, it really felt like almost like I wasn't allowed to go or that they didn't want me to go. And it wasn't just an age thing because I was about 10 at the time. My older brother was about 16. And I had cousins who were about 2 years older, but they were already in Grenada. So, I felt like even though I was young, I wasn't too young to understand what was happening. And I had very strong views about it. But nevertheless, I couldn't go. Now, here's the distinction that I didn't make then, but I did make a few years later. Everyone who was able to go to my grandmother's funeral, including my cousins, was actually born in Grenada. My brother and I are the only first-gen Americans in our family. And so at the time, not only were we not allowed to go, but it kind of felt like we didn't actually belong there anyway. So aside from that trip when I was about 3 years old, the next time I went to Grenada wasn't until I was about 21. That happened to be the same summer where I had just come back from an entire semester in Uganda and had already done a lot of traveling. So it was a true vacation in the fullest sense. I got to see family, went to the beach, and did all the things you would expect to do kind of on an island vacation. But since that trip when I was 21, I've only been back to Grenada about 3 times, and they've all been tied in some way, shape, or form to the passing of a relative. And that includes a trip that I took most recently after my uncle, my mother's brother, passed away this past summer. So here I am as an adult trying to understand this place that my parents called home. And the fact is that even my parents' connection to Grenada has dissipated over time because they've been US citizens for decades and have now effectively spent more time in the US than they ever spent in Grenada. So I say all of that to say, what is home? What does that mean for me and my supposed connection to this place that has been at best tangential and more often than not largely invisible to me in my own life, aside from, some of the customs that I mentioned. So I've been trying to make this really concerted effort to, I'll say, understand Grenada a bit more and to cultivate my own relationship with it outside of what I know from growing up and my parents. And so I've tried to do a couple of different things to sort of satisfy my own cultural curiosity, if you will. And I'm going to share them, things you might want to try, but, I would say tread lightly. And as I go through them, it'll probably make more sense. So I've tried to start asking more pointed questions about family connections and upbringing. When you hear stories as a kid, oftentimes you hear them with kid ears, like everything sounds kind of magical and great. And, you don't pour into the nuances. But I've really started to ask some of the more difficult questions about things that I've heard, relatives that maybe we were close to at one point, but maybe aren't as close to anymore. Um, Things that I just didn't understand back then. And like I said, you got to be a little careful, tread lightly when you're sort of digging into your family history because you can discover some things that maybe people didn't want you to know. But it's helped me feel more of a connection. The next point, and this is also a little controversial in its own way. I don't stay with my family when I go to Grenada. They live in the countryside, about 45 minutes away from the city center. I intentionally prefer to stay closer to the town, the main sort of hub of things near the beach. Now, again, depending on your family and your background, that is a no-no. Particularly for folks of color, like there's a whole thing about you stay with family. I do it intentionally because I like the idea of getting a chance to meet different people, whether it be locals or tourists, and getting to see Grenada through their eyes and having those conversations and interactions. It also forces me to navigate on my own a little bit and not just rely on family to shuttle me here, there, and everywhere. Riding the bus and all of the colorful folks that you meet while riding local transportation. And then to be honest, I'll cop to it as someone who I leans, team introvert. I need a space that's mine where I feel like I can just sort of get away and kind of do my own thing. When you stay with family, God bless them. They have their own rules and, keep the temperature where they want it and get up as early as they want to. And so I just like to be able to sort of navigate on my own. But um, that's been helpful for me in terms of getting to know this place again that I didn't really have a relationship with. And the last thing I would say is that I really do try to be a tourist when I go to Grenada. Like I've taken a tour of the island. I've visited the rum distillery. I've visited the chocolate factory where the chocolate on the island gets made. I've done things that even people in my family or other Grenadians don't necessarily do because I'm intentionally trying to see it through the eyes of someone that doesn't live there. And it's allowed me to appreciate the beauty of the island and therefore the beauty of where my family comes from in a completely different way and with older, wiser, fresher eyes. And it's really helped actually solidify my connection and relationship to the island. So, this idea of home, I've spoken a lot about it in sort of like this Caribbean context, but it also came up for me when I went to Uganda and Tanzania back in my 20s, again, when I was studying and studying abroad. I encountered a number of people on those travels in Africa who would say things like, welcome home, brother, threw in a little bit of the accent there, or you are back home. I knew they were making a reference to, transatlantic slave trade and that whole system that forced enslaved Africans from their original homes, throughout the diaspora. And so this idea of coming back or being back home was something that they would invoke, particularly because even when I was there, you didn't see a lot of Black Americans going back to Africa. Like it was almost a foreign concept to the Africans. And so they would almost always assume that I was from Ghana or some other place in West Africa when I was in East Africa. They were like, you look like one of us, but we're not sure where. And so it was this sort of foreign idea like, oh, you're from America. Like, okay. They would hear me talk and then clearly that gives it away. But I always had a real difficult time with this idea of being back home when I would, visit Africa, for example, because I was like, I don't have a real connection here. It doesn't feel real to me. And yes, I could say it, but if I didn't feel it, it felt like I was being disingenuous. And so that was something that I actually really struggled with. But as I think back on it now, I realized through those travels in Uganda, in Tanzania, and then subsequently, my, travels in Grenada, I do have relationships with these places. It's different, but it's intentional. And I've had unique experiences there that have shaped who I am and the person that I've become. And so I don't discount them and they are meaningful. And so I guess the one thing that I would, invite and encourage everyone to do is to really think about what does home signify for you? What does that really mean? Whether you were born here in America or abroad, I would just say be intentional about discovering where you and your family come from. Investigate some of those customs, ask those questions, cultivate that for yourself, particularly if you maybe didn't have, the best relationship with the place or didn't have the opportunity to visit as much as a kid. As an adult, you get to look at it with a different pair of eyes. And I would just say, let that journey of discovery be ongoing because it's going to make you appreciate who you are, what you've become, and how you show up in the world that much more. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Season 1 in the books. I'm really thankful that I was able to have this platform and space to have unique, thought-provoking, introspective conversations. A huge shout out and thank you to all of the guests who came on the podcast this season to share their stories, even though they didn't necessarily know what this was going to be or how it would go. It's not easy to be that vulnerable. And so I thank them for trusting me with their stories. I want to extend a huge thank you and shout out to engineer extraordinaire Josh Wilcox and his entire team at the Brooklyn Podcasting Studio for all of their help week in and week out. You guys are the best. And last, and probably most importantly, I would really like to thank all the listeners and viewers who decided to take a chance on this podcast and, to a certain degree, me as a host. I sincerely appreciate you all. I'm already looking forward to more guests and great conversations for season 2. So thank you again, and I will see you next time.